The goblet trembled in Wren Ashford's hand the moment she saw the man standing near the tall windows of the great hall. For 3 years, she had trained herself not to react to anything. Not to the shouting of guards, not to the cold stares of nobles, not even to the sound of her own name spoken by strangers who did not know what it truly meant. But the sight of that man's face, lit by the gold light of 100 candles, broke through every wall she had built. She stood frozen behind a marble pillar, the wine pitcher still tilted slightly in her grip, a single drop sliding down its silver edge and falling onto the polished floor. Around her the feast continued without pause. Musicians played a bright, cheerful song. Laughter rolled across the hall in waves. Somewhere near the throne, King Ronan Vos lifted his cup to a toast offered by one of his generals, unaware that his entire world was about to shift beneath him. Wren forced her feet to move. She had spent years learning how to disappear inside a crowded room, how to walk with her eyes low and her steps quiet, how to become nothing more than a shadow carrying wine. Tonight, disappearing was not an option. The man by the window was Lord Corwin Hale, and the last time she had seen his face, it had been lit not by candlelight, but by fire, on the night her family's home burned to the ground. She had been 8 years old. She remembered very little of that night with clear detail, only fragments that returned to her in dreams. The smell of smoke thick enough to choke on, her mother's voice calling her name from somewhere she could not reach, a stranger's hand pulling her through a broken window and into the cold night air, telling her to run and not look back. She had run. She had kept running for years, moving from village to village, hiding her true bloodline, until she found work as a servant inside the very palace that housed the family many believed responsible for that fire. She had never planned to confront anyone. She had told herself, over and over, that survival meant silence. That speaking the truth out loud would only get her killed, or worse, forgotten entirely, erased the way her family had been erased. But standing there with the pitcher shaking in her hand, watching Lord Corwin Hale smile and raise his own cup in celebration of a king whose throne had been built partly on her family's ashes, something inside her refused to stay quiet any longer. She set the pitcher down on a side table with more force than she intended. A nearby servant glanced at her, confused, but Wren was already moving, weaving between the guests, with her heart pounding so loudly she was certain someone would hear it. She did not look at Lord Corwin again. If she looked at him, she was afraid she would lose her courage entirely. Instead, she looked toward the throne. King Ronan Vos sat with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted his place in the world. He was young for a ruler, only recently crowned after his father's sudden passing, yet he carried himself with the calm authority of someone twice his age. His dark hair caught the candlelight, and his sharp eyes moved across the room, the way a wolf's eyes move across open ground, always watching, always aware. Nobles leaned toward him when they spoke, eager for his attention. Guards stood at careful distances, alert but relaxed, trusting the peace of the evening. Wren had served in this palace long enough to know the unspoken rules. Servants did not approach the king directly unless summoned. Servants did not speak unless spoken to. Servants certainly did not lean close to a ruler's ear in the middle of a public feast. Breaking that rule could end with her thrown from the palace, or worse, questioned by guards, who would eventually discover exactly who she was and where she came from. She walked forward anyway. A serving girl named Mira caught her arm gently as she passed. Mira was the closest thing Wren had to a friend inside these walls. A kind-hearted Omega girl, with quick eyes and a gentler nature than the harsh palace seemed to allow. "Wren, you look pale," Mira whispered. "What is wrong?" "Nothing," Wren said, though her voice shook slightly. "I need to bring the king fresh wine, that is all." Mira's eyes narrowed with concern, but she released Wren's arm, sensing there was no point in arguing. Wren picked up a fresh pitcher from a nearby table and continued walking, each step feeling heavier than the last, as though the marble floor itself was trying to hold her back. As she neared the throne, one of the guards, a tall man named Elias with a scar above his eyebrow, straightened and gave her a questioning look. "The king's cup is empty," Wren said quietly, keeping her eyes low, her voice steady despite the storm inside her chest. Elias studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod and stepped aside, allowing her closer. Servants refilled cups constantly throughout the feast. There was nothing unusual in her approach, not yet. She climbed the 3 low steps leading to the throne platform, her hands surprisingly steady now as she lifted the pitcher and began pouring wine into the king's golden cup. Up close, she could see the fine detail of his formal coat, the silver embroidery along the collar, the faint scar along his jaw that spoke of battles fought before he ever wore a crown. He did not look at her. Kings rarely looked at the servants who filled their cups. He was speaking to a nobleman seated nearby, discussing trade routes along the eastern border, his tone confident and unbothered. Ren finished pouring and straightened the pitcher, and for a brief moment, the noise of the hall seemed to fade around her. This was her chance. It might be the only chance she would ever have. She leaned forward, close enough that her lips nearly brushed the edge of his ear, and she whispered 5 words, soft enough that only he could hear them beneath the music and laughter filling the hall. "I know what your father did." She straightened immediately and stepped back, lowering her eyes the way a servant should, as though she had said nothing at all. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then King Ronan Vos went still. His entire body seemed to freeze mid-motion, his hand halting halfway toward the goblet she had just filled. The nobleman beside him kept speaking for a moment, before noticing the king was no longer listening. Slowly, Ronan turned his head toward Ren, and the color drained from his face so completely that even the guests nearby noticed the sudden change. The music continued, but the laughter around the throne began to quiet, as people sensed something had shifted. Whispers rippled outward, like water disturbed by a stone. Nobles exchanged confused glances. Benias the guard straightened sharply, his hand moving instinctively toward the hilt of his sword, uncertain what threat had suddenly appeared, if any threat existed at all. Ronan's eyes locked onto Ren's face, searching, as though trying to determine whether he had misheard her, whether the words she spoke were some cruel trick of his own mind. But Ren did not look away. She held his gaze, her chin lifted slightly, refusing to shrink back now that the words were already spoken. "Say that again," Ronan said quietly, his voice low enough that only she and the nearest guards could hear. "Not here," Ren answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not where everyone can listen." The hall had gone almost entirely silent now, the musicians faltering as they noticed the king's stillness, the guests turning to stare at the throne, whispering behind raised hands. A king who never lost his composure in public had gone pale as bone in the space of a single breath, staring at a servant girl as though she had struck him. Ronan rose from his throne so suddenly that his chair scraped loudly against the stone floor, the sound echoing through the silent hall. He set down his untouched cup and turned to the crowd, forcing his voice into something resembling calm authority. "Continue the feast," he said. "I have matters that require my attention." No one moved for a moment, stunned by the abruptness of his command. Then, slowly, the musicians resumed their song, though quieter and less certain than before, and the guests began speaking again in low, uncertain tones, their eyes darting toward the king as he stepped down from the throne platform. He turned to Ren. "Come with me," he said, his voice tight, controlled, but unmistakably shaken. Ren's heart pounded as she followed him, aware of the eyes tracking her every step, aware that whatever safety she had built for herself inside these walls had just shattered completely. Elias moved to follow as well, but Ronan lifted a hand, stopping him. "Not you," Ronan said. "Not yet. Guard the doors. No one enters." Elias hesitated, clearly uneasy about leaving his king alone with an unknown servant after such a strange moment, but he obeyed, stepping back and gesturing for 2 other guards to take position at the entrance to the private chamber Ronan was already walking toward. Ren followed the king down a narrow corridor lit by flickering torches, her footsteps echoing against the stone walls. Behind her, the muffled sound of the feast continued, but it felt distant now, as though she had already stepped into another world entirely, one where the truth she carried for so long could no longer stay buried. Ronan pushed open a heavy wooden door and stepped into a small private study, lined with old books and maps, a single window overlooking the dark gardens below. He turned to face her the moment the door closed behind them, his expression no longer that of a composed ruler, but of a man who had just been shaken to his core. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice quiet but demanding. "And what exactly do you know about my father?" Ren stood tall despite the fear coiling tightly in her chest, despite every instinct screaming at her to run. to deny everything, to disappear back into the safety of silence she had relied on for years. But there was no going back now. The words were already spoken. The king already knew something had changed. She took a slow breath, steadying herself, and met his eyes without flinching. "My name is Ren," she said, "and I am the last surviving heir of the family your father destroyed." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything the crowded hall had held only minutes before. Ronan's jaw tightened, his hands curling slightly at his sides, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of her words settling between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples neither of them could yet predict. Outside the study window, the gardens lay dark and quiet beneath a sky scattered with stars, indifferent to the storm now beginning inside the palace walls. Somewhere in that darkness, unseen by either of them, a figure watched the lit window of the private study, with sharp interest, already calculating how this unexpected turn of events might be used to his own advantage. Lord Draven Blackwood smiled faintly to himself, and turned away, disappearing into the shadows of the garden path, already forming the beginnings of a plan that would set the entire kingdom on a collision course no one could stop. Ronan did not sit down. He stood near the cold fireplace, his arms crossed, studying Ren, as though she might vanish if he looked away for even a second. The study felt smaller than it had a moment ago, the walls pressing closer, the silence between them thick enough to touch. "You will need to explain that," he said finally. Every word of it. Ren's hands were still trembling slightly, though she kept them clasped in front of her, hoping he would not notice. She had imagined this moment countless times over the years, lying awake in servant quarters, whispering the story to herself in the dark, just to remember it clearly. Yet now that the moment had actually arrived, the words felt harder to find than she expected. 11 years ago, she began, my family lived in the Eastern Valley, near the border your father controlled before he expanded the kingdom's reach. We were not nobles. We were not warriors. My father raised horses, and my mother kept records for the local trade houses. We were ordinary people. 11 years ago, my father was fighting 3 wars at once, Ronan said quietly. The Eastern Valley was contested territory. Skirmishes happened there constantly. This was not a skirmish, Ren said, her voice hardening slightly. Soldiers came in the night. They did not announce themselves as your father's men, but I saw the banner they carried before they set the house on fire. Silver wolf on black cloth. I was 8 years old. I remember it clearly, because I have spent every year since then trying to forget it and failing. Ronan's jaw tightened. The silver wolf on black cloth was unmistakably his family's banner, the same symbol that hung above the throne she had just served wine beside only minutes earlier. Many banners were carried into that valley during the border conflicts, he said, though his voice lacked the certainty it had carried moments before. Rebel factions sometimes stole royal colors to disguise their attacks, and turn local sympathy against my father. That is what I told myself for years, Ren said. That it must have been a mistake, or a trick, or someone else entirely. I wanted to believe that, because believing it meant I did not have to hate the family whose walls I would one day be forced to serve inside just to survive. Something in her voice made Ronan pause. He studied her more closely now, noting the quiet steadiness beneath her fear, the way she spoke not like someone seeking revenge, but like someone who had carried an unbearable weight for far too long, and simply needed someone else to finally share it. What changed your mind? He asked. Ren reached into the small pouch tied at her waist, hidden beneath her servant's apron, and withdrew a thin gold ring, old and slightly worn, engraved with a pattern of interlocking vines. This belonged to my mother, she said, holding it out for him to see, though she did not offer it into his hands. It was given to her family generations ago, a mark of an old alliance between our house and the Eastern Valley Lords. 3 years ago, I found record of a payment made from your father's private treasury to a company of mercenaries, dated the same week as the fire, listed only as compensation for a valley clearing operation. I did not understand what that meant until I matched it against the date carved into the back of this ring, the day my family was declared officially deceased by the crown's own scribes. Ronan's expression shifted, the last traces of doubt in his eyes giving way to something closer to dread. He knew his father's treasury records intimately, having studied them for years in preparation for his own rule. A valley clearing operation was not an unusual phrase within those old ledgers. It was, in fact, a phrase he had seen before, and never questioned, assuming it referred to routine border maintenance rather than anything more sinister. "Where did you find that record?" he asked quietly. "In the archive room beneath the West Tower," Wren admitted. "I have worked in this palace for nearly 2 years. It was not difficult to find opportunities to look, once I knew what I was searching for." Ronan turned away from her, running a hand through his dark hair, his mind racing through years of memories, searching for anything that might confirm or deny what she was telling him. His father had never been a gentle ruler. Ronan had grown up watching him make hard decisions, decisions that sometimes cost lives in the name of securing the kingdom's borders. He had told himself, as most sons do, that his father's cruelty was necessary, that peace sometimes required difficult sacrifices. He had never considered that those sacrifices might have included the deliberate destruction of an innocent family, simply because their land sat on a valuable trade route. "If this is true," he said slowly, "why come to me now? Why not years ago, the moment you found that record?" "Because knowledge without protection is dangerous," Wren said. "I am an Omega with no family name, no allies, and no proof strong enough to survive a formal court challenge. If I had spoken too soon, to the wrong person, I would have simply disappeared, the same way my family disappeared. I needed to wait until I understood exactly who around this palace could be trusted, and who could not." "And what changed tonight?" Ronan asked. "Why choose this moment, in the middle of a feast, in front of half the kingdom's nobility?" Wren hesitated, glancing toward the window, though there was nothing to see beyond the dark glass. "Lord Corwin Hale is in your hall tonight," she said. "I recognized him the moment I saw his face. He was among the men who came to my family's home that night. I saw him clearly, illuminated by firelight, giving orders to the soldiers as though he had done this before. I have spent years wondering if I imagined his face wrong, if fear had distorted my memory. Seeing him tonight, laughing and drinking in your hall as though nothing happened, I could not stay silent any longer." Ronan's expression darkened. Lord Corwin Hale was one of his father's oldest advisors, a man who had remained close to the crown even after Ronan's coronation, offering guidance on border security and military strategy. If what Wren said was true, Corwin had not simply followed orders from Ronan's father. He had personally overseen the destruction of an innocent family and continued serving the crown afterward without the slightest visible remorse. "This is a serious accusation," Ronan said, "against a man who currently sits on my council." "I am aware," Wren said. "Which is exactly why I did not make it lightly, and exactly why I chose to speak to you privately, rather than announce it in front of the entire hall. I do not want revenge built on chaos. I want the truth acknowledged, quietly if necessary, but acknowledged." Ronan studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, a mixture of guilt, suspicion, and reluctant respect. Few people dared to speak to him so directly, let alone an Omega servant risking everything by doing so. "You understand," he said finally, "that if this becomes known, both our lives may be in danger. Mine, for questioning my own father's legacy in front of a council loyal to old ways. Yours, for daring to accuse a powerful lord without an army behind you." "I understand," Wren said quietly. "I have understood that risk since the moment I decided to come work inside these walls." Ronan exhaled slowly, the weight of the evening settling heavily across his shoulders. Outside the study, faint sounds of the feast still echoed through the palace halls, laughter and music continuing, without any awareness of the storm quietly building behind closed doors. "No one else can know of this conversation," he said. "Not yet. Not until I understand exactly what happened, and exactly who else may have been involved." Wren nodded slowly. Relief and fear tangled together inside her chest. She had expected disbelief, perhaps even anger, directed at her for daring to accuse the crown. Instead, she found something she had not expected at all. A king, willing to question the very foundation his own throne was built upon. Neither of them noticed the faint shift of a curtain near the study's second window, nor the soft click of a door somewhere down the corridor, closing just quietly enough to avoid detection. Lord Draven Blackwood had already returned from the garden, and he had heard far more than either Wren or Ronan realized. Morning came slowly over the palace, gray light spreading across the stone towers, as servants began their daily tasks, unaware that anything unusual had happened the night before. Wren had not slept. She had returned to her small quarters near the servant wing sometime after midnight, her mind racing through every possible outcome of what she had done, every way the king might still choose to silence her rather than help her. She rose before dawn and began her duties as usual, carrying linens through the quiet corridors, refilling washing basins, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might sense the tension still coiled tightly beneath her calm expression. Mira found her near the laundry room shortly after sunrise, her face full of questions she clearly wanted to ask, but did not dare speak aloud in the open hallway. "You disappeared last night," Mira whispered, pulling Wren gently into an empty side room. Everyone was talking about it. The king went pale and left his own feast. People are saying all sorts of things, that there was an assassination attempt, that a messenger brought terrible news from the border, that a rival house sent a curse into the hall. "None of that is true," Wren said carefully. "I do not know what happened. I was simply refilling cups when the king suddenly rose and left." Mira studied her closely, clearly unconvinced, but she did not push further, sensing the exhaustion and worry hidden beneath Wren's calm tone. "Just be careful," she said instead. "Whatever happened, the whole palace is unsettled this morning. Guards were posted outside the West Archive overnight. No one is allowed near it until further notice." Wren's stomach tightened at that news. The archive room, where she had once quietly searched through old treasury ledgers, was now guarded. She wondered whether Ronan had ordered the guards himself, protecting the very evidence she had described, or whether someone else, someone who wished that evidence destroyed, had moved first. She did not have long to wonder. Later that morning, as she carried a tray of folded linens toward the guest quarters, a young page intercepted her in the hallway, his expression nervous and hurried. "The king requests your presence," the page said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else overheard. "You are to come to the private study immediately, through the servant corridor, not the main hall." Wren set down the tray and followed the boy through a narrow passage rarely used by anyone outside the palace staff, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and fear. When she reached the study, Ronan was already waiting, along with a man she did not recognize, older, dressed in the deep green robes of the royal physician and record keeper, standing near the desk with a stack of aged documents. "This is Garrick," Ronan said, gesturing toward the older man. "He served my father for many years, and now serves me. I trust him completely, and after this morning, I believe you will understand why I needed his help." Garrick studied Wren with sharp, careful eyes, the kind of gaze that missed very little. "The king told me what you shared with him last night," he said. "I have spent the early hours searching through what remains of the old treasury records. Most of what existed from that period has been moved, reorganized, or in some cases, appears to be missing entirely." Wren's breath caught. "Missing?" "Not destroyed, I believe," Garrick said. "At least not yet. Simply relocated, likely by someone attempting to control what information remains easily accessible. Records of that sensitivity are sometimes moved to the private vault beneath the royal chapel, accessible only with direct authorization from the crown." "Someone moved them overnight," Ronan said, his voice tight with barely restrained frustration. "Which means someone else already suspects that this conversation happened, or fears it might happen eventually." Wren thought immediately of the faint sound she thought she had heard the night before, a door closing somewhere down the corridor as she and Ronan spoke in private. She had dismissed it at the time as nothing more than a servant passing by, but now the memory returned to her with unsettling clarity. "There may have been someone listening last night," she said. "I heard something near the second window while we spoke. I did not think much of it at the time." Ronan's expression darkened further. He exchanged a quick glance with Garrick, who nodded grimly, clearly already suspecting the same possibility. "If someone overheard us," Ronan said, "then whoever moved those records likely already knows exactly what we discussed, and is now working to protect themselves before we can gather enough proof to act. Lord Corwin Hale has many allies within the palace staff," Garrick added quietly. "It would not be difficult for him to learn of last night's conversation quickly, especially if someone loyal to him happened to be nearby." Wren felt a fresh wave of fear settle over her, colder than before. If Corwin already suspected she had spoken to the king, her safety inside these walls, fragile as it already was, had likely disappeared entirely. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Ronan straightened, some of his earlier shock hardening into quiet determination. We find another way to prove what happened in that valley, he said. If the treasury records have been hidden, there may be other sources. Witnesses who survived that night. Correspondence between my father and his commanders. Anything that confirms the truth beyond a single ring and a servant's memory, however clear that memory may be. There is someone else, Ren said slowly. A memory surfacing that she had not considered sharing until this moment. The man who pulled me from the burning house that night, I never learned his full name. He told me to call him only by the name Old Fen. He said he had once served in your father's army, before leaving under circumstances he never fully explained to me. If he is still alive, he may remember far more than I do. Do you know where to find him? Ronan asked. The last time I saw him, years ago, he was living near the southern trade road, close to a small village called Thornfield, Ren said. He may have moved since then. He may not even still be alive. But it is the only lead I have beyond what I already told you. Garrick made a note of the location, his expression thoughtful. It would take several days to travel there and return safely, he said. And it cannot be done openly, not without drawing suspicion from anyone watching the palace's movements closely. Ronan considered this for a long moment, his gaze moving between Ren and Garrick, weighing options that seemed to grow more complicated with each passing minute. I will send a small, trusted party to Thornfield, he said finally, quietly, under the cover of a routine border inspection. In the meantime, Ren cannot remain in the open servant quarters, where anyone might easily reach her. I have managed to remain hidden inside this palace for 2 years, Ren said, a flicker of pride and stubbornness rising despite her fear. I do not need special protection that will only draw more attention to me. 2 years hiding as an ordinary servant is very different from surviving as the only witness capable of exposing a lie the crown has protected for over a decade, Ronan said, his tone firm but not unkind. If Corwin suspects you spoke to me, he will not hesitate to remove that threat entirely, and he will not be gentle about it. Ren opened her mouth to argue further, but the seriousness in Ronan's eyes stopped her. She thought of the fire again, the smoke, the stranger's hand pulling her through the broken window, the years spent running and hiding simply to stay alive. She had come too far to let fear silence her again, but she also understood, with painful clarity, that surviving this moment required more than stubborn independence. What do you propose? She asked quietly. You will move into the Eastern Guest Wing, Ronan said. Officially, you will be introduced as a distant relation of Garrick's, brought in to assist with the royal archives, due to your skill with old records. It will explain your presence near sensitive documents, and place you under closer, more discreet protection, without drawing obvious attention. Ren hesitated, uncertain, but she recognized the careful logic behind his plan. And Corwin, she asked, what happens if he grows suspicious regardless? Then we will need to move faster than he expects, Ronan said, and hope that Thornfield still holds the truth we need, before he finds a way to bury it completely. Outside the study window, the pale morning light had begun to strengthen into full daylight, illuminating the palace gardens where, unseen by any of them, Lord Draven Blackwood walked slowly along a quiet path, deep in thought, already composing the careful words he intended to share with Lord Corwin Hale, before the sun fully rose over the kingdom's uneasy new day. Lord Draven Blackwood had always understood that power in the palace rarely belonged to those who shouted the loudest. It belonged to those who listened carefully, waited patiently, and struck only when the timing served their own interests best. He found Lord Corwin Hale in the private study reserved for senior council members, reviewing correspondence from the Southern Territories, his silver hair catching the morning light through tall windows overlooking the training grounds. You look troubled, Draven said, closing the door quietly behind him. Corwin did not look up immediately from his papers. The king left his own feast last night without explanation, he said. I am simply trying to understand why. I can offer some understanding, Draven said, taking a seat across from him without waiting for an invitation. I happened to walk near the private study last night. I overheard a conversation that I believe concerns you directly. Corwin's hand paused over his papers, though his expression remained carefully controlled. Go on. A servant girl approached the king during the feast, Draven said. An Omega, apparently working within the palace for some time now. She claims to be the last surviving heir of a family destroyed during the border conflicts of the Eastern Valley, over a decade ago. She named you specifically as one of the soldiers present that night. Corwin's face remained still, but something flickered behind his eyes, a tightening around his jaw that Draven noted with quiet satisfaction. He had spent years reading the subtle signals of powerful men, and he recognized immediately that this accusation, whatever its source, had struck closer to truth than Corwin wished to admit. That valley saw many conflicts during those years, Corwin said carefully. Rebel factions, border skirmishes, mercenary raids disguised under stolen banners. It would not be difficult for a frightened child to misremember details from such a chaotic time. Perhaps, Draven said, leaning back in his chair with practiced ease. Though the king did not react as though he believed the girl was simply confused, he turned pale. Corwin. He left his own celebration and spoke with her privately for nearly an hour. This morning, guards have been posted outside the West Archive, and I am told certain treasury records from that period have already been relocated. Corwin set down his papers slowly, his composure finally cracking just slightly at the edges. Relocated by whom? I do not know, Draven admitted, though I suspect Garrick's involvement, given his long history of managing the Crown's more sensitive documentation. It seems the king intends to investigate this claim rather than dismiss it outright. Corwin rose from his seat and walked toward the window, staring out at the training grounds below, without truly seeing them, his mind clearly racing through possibilities and consequences. Neither man spoke aloud. Draven watched him carefully, recognizing the opportunity forming in front of him, an opportunity he had no intention of allowing to pass unused. You seem unusually calm for a man accused of participating in the destruction of an innocent family, Draven said quietly. Corwin turned back to face him, his expression hardening into something colder and more guarded. Say what you actually came here to say, Draven. You did not walk into my study this morning simply to deliver gossip. Draven allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Corwin had never been a fool, whatever his other flaws might be. I came to offer an alliance, Draven said. Whatever happened in that valley, 11 years ago, is no longer the true concern. The true concern is what happens now, if the king chooses to publicly expose old crimes committed under his father's rule. It would weaken the crown's authority significantly, create division among the noble houses, and potentially open the throne itself to challenge from ambitious rivals. Rivals such as yourself, Corwin said flatly. Rivals such as either of us, Draven replied smoothly. I have no particular loyalty to defending your past actions, Corwin, whatever they may have been, but I do have significant interest in preventing this kingdom from descending into chaos over old accusations that cannot be easily proven, and I suspect you have equally strong interest in ensuring this particular truth never reaches a formal court hearing. Corwin studied him carefully, weighing the offer, clearly recognizing that Draven's assistance came with strings attached that would bind them together in ways neither man could easily undo later. What exactly are you proposing? The servant girl is the only direct witness, Draven said. Whatever evidence she claims to possess, a ring, fragmented childhood memories, none of it holds significant weight in a formal proceeding without corroboration. If we can ensure no additional evidence surfaces, this entire matter can be dismissed as the confused claims of a grieving young woman, nothing more. And if additional evidence does surface, Corwin asked, then we will need to address that possibility before it becomes a problem, Draven said simply, his tone leaving little doubt about what such an address might eventually require. Corwin returned to his seat slowly, considering the weight of what Draven was suggesting. He had spent over a decade building his position within the crown's inner circle, carefully distancing himself from the more brutal aspects of the old king's border campaigns, presenting himself instead as a wise, measured advisor, focused on peace and stability. The truth of that valley, if fully exposed, would undo years of careful reputation building in a single devastating moment. I will need to know more about what the girl actually possesses, Corwin said finally, and where the king intends to search for further proof. I already have people watching the servant quarters and the eastern guest wing, Draven said. It seems the king has already moved to protect her more directly, introducing her under a false identity, connected to Garrick's household. It should not be difficult to monitor her movements closely from this point forward. And Garrick himself, Corwin asked. How deeply is he involved? Deeply enough that removing him from consideration would draw far too much suspicion, Draven said. He has served the crown faithfully for decades. No, our approach must be more careful than that. We watch. We wait. We identify exactly what threat this girl and her missing witness actually pose, and we address it quietly, before the king has enough proof to act publicly. Corwin nodded slowly, though something uneasy lingered behind his eyes, a flicker of guilt he quickly buried beneath practiced composure. There is no missing witness, he said quietly, not that I am aware of. Draven's interest sharpened immediately. Explain. The valley clearing operation was meant to be thorough, Corwin said, his voice dropping lower, careful even within the privacy of his own study. Every structure, every family connected to that trade route, eliminated to secure the land for the crown's expansion plans. I was told the operation succeeded completely. If this girl survived, and if she claims someone else pulled her from that fire and helped her escape, it means the operation failed to account for at least one loose thread that has apparently remained hidden for over a decade. A loose thread that may still be alive somewhere, capable of confirming everything this girl claims, Draven said grimly. If such a person exists, Corwin said, he would need to be found and silenced before the king's men locate him first. Draven rose from his chair, already calculating the resources such a search would require, the discreet contacts he could summon to handle matters requiring absolute silence. I will begin making inquiries immediately, he said, quietly, of course. We cannot afford even the smallest misstep now that the king himself has taken personal interest in this matter. Corwin nodded once, his expression settling back into the calm, controlled mask he had worn for years within these palace walls, though beneath that mask, old fears he had believed long buried were beginning to stir once more, threatening to unravel everything he had carefully built since that fire so many years ago. Neither man noticed the young page lingering just outside the study door, having paused momentarily to overhear fragments of their conversation, before continuing quickly down the corridor, his young mind already turning over what he had heard, uncertain whether it was significant enough to report, or dangerous enough to simply forget entirely. 3 days passed before Wren settled into anything resembling comfort within the eastern guest wing. Her new quarters were far grander than the small servant room she had grown used to, with tall windows overlooking a quiet courtyard, and a soft bed that felt almost foreign after years of simpler living. Yet comfort did little to ease the constant tension coiled inside her chest. Every footstep in the hallway outside her door made her flinch. Every unfamiliar face among the palace staff made her wonder whether they had been sent to watch her, or worse. Garrick visited her each morning under the guise of archive work, carrying old ledgers and dusty scrolls to maintain the appearance of legitimate research, though their true purpose remained focused on piecing together whatever fragments of truth still existed. Ronan visited less frequently, careful not to draw attention through obvious closeness with a woman recently introduced as a distant relation of his archivist, though when he did visit, his presence brought a strange, unexpected comfort that Wren found herself both grateful for and slightly wary of. The party I sent toward Thornfield should arrive within the next 2 days, Ronan told her during one such visit, standing near the window of her quarters, while Garrick reviewed papers at a nearby desk. I selected men I trust completely, soldiers who served under my personal command rather than my father's, to reduce the risk of information reaching Corwin before we are ready. And if old Fen is no longer there, Wren asked quietly, if he has moved, or passed away in the years since I last saw him, then we continue searching for other evidence, Ronan said, though I will admit, finding him would make everything considerably easier. Wren studied him for a moment, noting the tightness around his eyes, the way exhaustion had begun to show beneath his composed exterior. She understood, perhaps better than anyone else within these walls, exactly how heavily this discovery weighed upon him. Whatever his father had done, Ronan now carried the burden of deciding how to respond, knowing that any choice he made would ripple outward across the entire kingdom. You did not have to help me, she said. You could have dismissed everything I told you that night, protected your father's legacy, and continued ruling exactly as you intended, before I ever whispered a single word in your ear. I could have, Ronan admitted. Many rulers before me would have done exactly that, burying uncomfortable truths to preserve a comfortable peace. But I do not wish to build my reign on lies I know to be lies, even if uncovering them proves costly. Something in his voice carried a quiet sincerity that caught Ren off guard. A vulnerability she had not expected from a man who commanded armies and controlled the fate of an entire kingdom. She found herself studying his face more closely than she intended, noticing details she had somehow missed during their previous, more urgent conversations. The faint lines of worry near his eyes, the steady, deliberate way he chose his words, as though each one carried weight he refused to waste carelessly. Garrick cleared his throat softly from the desk, breaking the moment between them. "There is something else you should both be aware of," he said, setting down the scroll he had been reviewing. "I have heard whispers among the palace staff, nothing confirmed, but concerning enough to mention. Lord Draven Blackwood has apparently been making discreet inquiries regarding travelers passing through the southern trade routes over the past several days." Ren's stomach tightened. "The same route my party would need to travel to reach Thornfield." "It could simply be unrelated business," Garrick said, though his tone suggested he did not fully believe his own reassurance. "Draven maintains many interests across various trade routes throughout the kingdom, but given recent events, I believe it would be wise to consider the possibility that he suspects our intentions." Ronan's expression darkened. "If Draven and Corwin have allied themselves against us, they will not simply wait for us to gather proof before acting against it. Then we need to move faster," Ren said, rising from her seat, despite Garrick's earlier insistence that she remain within the guest wing as much as possible. "If Old Fen is truly in danger because of what I told you, I cannot simply sit here waiting while others risk their lives searching for him." "Absolutely not," Ronan said firmly. "If Draven suspects a witness exists, sending you directly into potential danger would only confirm exactly what he is trying to discover." "Then what would you have me do?" Ren asked, frustration finally breaking through her carefully maintained calm. "Continue hiding, the same way I have hidden for years, while everyone around me makes decisions about a truth that belongs to my family, not yours." The room fell silent for a moment, the tension between them sharp and unexpected. Garrick glanced between the two of them, clearly recognizing the weight of unspoken emotion beneath their argument, something far more complicated than simple disagreement over strategy. "You are right that this truth belongs to you," Ronan said finally, his voice softer now. "I do not intend to keep you hidden away, simply because it feels safer for me to manage this matter without your involvement. But I need you to understand that if something happens to you now, after everything you have already survived, we lose not only a witness, but the very person this truth was meant to protect in the first place." Ren's anger softened slightly, though the frustration of years spent feeling powerless remained close beneath the surface. "I have spent my entire life letting others decide what is safest for me," she said quietly. "First as a frightened child pulled from a burning house, and then as a servant hiding my true identity, simply to survive within these walls. I am tired of being protected from the very truth I am trying to expose." Ronan crossed the room slowly, stopping close enough that she could see the sincerity clearly etched across his features. "Then let us find a way forward together," he said. "Not you hidden away, and not you walking blindly into danger, but a path that allows you to reclaim the truth you have carried alone for far too long, without losing you in the process." Something shifted quietly between them in that moment, a fragile understanding neither of them fully acknowledged aloud, though Garrick, watching carefully from his desk, noticed it clearly enough, filing the observation away with the same careful attention he gave to every important detail within these palace walls. "There is a compromise," Garrick offered after a moment, breaking the charged silence gently. "Ren does not need to travel to Thornfield herself, but she could accompany a smaller, more discreet group toward the southern border town of Millhaven, close enough to remain informed and involved, while allowing the original search party to continue their journey without unnecessary risk." Ronan considered this for a long moment before nodding slowly. "It is not without danger," he said, looking toward Ren, "but it offers a reasonable balance between caution and involvement." Ren met his gaze steadily, feeling for the first time in years as though her voice truly mattered in decisions concerning her own fate. "Then that is what we will do," she said. Outside the guest wing window, evening shadows stretched long across the quiet courtyard, unaware of the quiet resolve settling firmly between the three people gathered inside, nor of the danger already moving steadily toward them from the southern trade roads, where Lord Draven's carefully chosen agents had already begun their own search, following leads that would soon lead them dangerously close to a small village called Thornfield. The road to Millhaven wound through dense forest before opening into rolling farmland, and Wren spent most of the 2-day journey wrapped in a plain traveling cloak, her hood raised against curious eyes despite the relatively quiet route they had chosen. Ronan had insisted on joining the smaller party himself, much to Garrick's visible concern, arguing that a king's absence from the palace for a few days could be explained through routine diplomatic visits to nearby territories, a common enough occurrence that it would not immediately raise suspicion. They traveled with only 4 guards, all personally selected by Ronan for their loyalty and discretion, along with Garrick, who insisted on accompanying them despite his age, citing his intimate knowledge of the old treasury records as essential should any physical evidence still exist within Millhaven's local archives. "You did not need to come yourself," Wren said quietly, riding beside Ronan along a narrow forest path, as afternoon light filtered gently through the canopy above them. "I did," Ronan replied simply. "Whatever happened 11 years ago happened because of decisions made by my family. I will not hide safely within palace walls, while others risk themselves uncovering truths I should have questioned long before now." Wren studied him for a moment, noting again the quiet determination that seemed to define so much of his character, so different from the cold, distant image of alpha rulers she had grown up fearing. "Your father must have been very different from you," she said carefully. Ronan's expression grew distant, thoughtful. "In many ways, yes," he admitted. He believed strength meant never showing doubt, never questioning decisions once made, regardless of their cost. "I grew up believing the same, until circumstances forced me to see things differently." "What changed?" Wren asked. "You did," Ronan said quietly, meeting her eyes briefly, before returning his attention to the path ahead. "Or rather, the truth you carried changed something inside me that I did not fully understand myself until these past few days." Wren felt warmth rise unexpectedly in her chest, quickly followed by a flicker of uncertainty. She had not traveled this road seeking anything beyond justice for her family, yet something had clearly shifted between herself and the king during these past several days, something neither of them had directly acknowledged, though both seemed increasingly aware of its presence. Their conversation was interrupted by one of the guards riding ahead, who raised a hand suddenly, signaling the group to halt. Ronan's posture shifted immediately into careful alertness, his earlier openness replaced by the sharp focus of a trained leader. "Riders approaching from the southern bend," the guard called back quietly. 6, perhaps 7, moving quickly. Ronan exchanged a tense glance with Garrick before turning to Wren. "Stay close to me," he said quietly. "If this is trouble, we cannot afford confusion." The riders emerged from the tree line moments later, dressed in plain traveling clothes without visible house colors, though their disciplined formation suggested trained soldiers rather than common travelers or bandits. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with cold, calculating eyes, brought his horse to a stop several yards from Ronan's group, studying them carefully before speaking. "Strange to see royal guards traveling this far south without formal announcement," the man said, his tone carefully neutral, though tension remained evident beneath his words. "We travel quietly by choice," Ronan replied evenly, careful not to reveal his identity directly. "Diplomatic matters sometimes require discretion." The stranger's gaze shifted briefly toward Wren, lingering just long enough to suggest recognition, or at least suspicion, before returning to Ronan. "Diplomatic matters rarely require an archivist and an unmarked Omega woman," he said. "Lord Draven sends his regards, and a warning that certain roads have grown unsafe for travelers seeking old, forgotten truths." Ronan's expression hardened immediately, any pretense of casual travel abandoned. "You serve Draven directly then," he said. "I serve whoever pays for results," the man replied simply. "And I have been paid quite well to ensure certain individuals do not reach certain destinations." The guards accompanying Ronan tensed visibly, hands moving carefully toward weapons, though no one moved first, the tension stretching taut between the two groups like a bowstring drawn to its limit. Wren's heart pounded, memories of fire and fear rising unbidden from the depths of her mind, though she forced herself to remain steady, refusing to let old terror control her now. "You are outnumbered," Ronan said calmly, though his voice carried unmistakable authority. "And you are threatening the king directly, whether you realize that fact or not." The stranger's eyes widened slightly with genuine surprise, quickly masked behind renewed calculation. He had clearly not expected to encounter the king himself along this quiet forest road, and the realization visibly shifted his approach. "My employer did not mention royal involvement," he said carefully. "Your employer clearly did not share everything with you," Ronan replied, "which suggests he considers your life expendable in service of protecting his own secrets. I would think carefully before continuing to serve someone with so little regard for your safety." A tense silence stretched between the two groups, the stranger clearly weighing his options, calculating whether direct confrontation with the king's personal guard was worth whatever payment Draven had promised him. Finally, he lowered his hand from his weapon, signaling his men to do the same. "We were paid to discourage travel along this route," he said, "not to engage the crown directly. Consider your path noted, Your Majesty. What you do with that knowledge is your own concern." Without further explanation, the stranger turned his horse and led his men back toward the tree line, disappearing quickly into the forest shadows, leaving Ronan's party standing tense and alert along the quiet road. "That was too easy," Garrick said quietly, once the strangers had vanished from sight. "Draven would not send men simply to deliver a warning without expecting some form of retreat or hesitation on our part. He is testing how far we are willing to go," Ronan said grimly, "and likely reporting our movements back to him immediately." "Then we no longer have the advantage of secrecy," Ren said, her voice steady despite the fear still lingering from the confrontation. "Draven and Corwin already know we are searching for Old Fen. Which means we need to reach Thornfield before they do," Ronan said, urging his horse forward once more. "Whatever protection that warning offered us today will not last long." The group pressed onward with renewed urgency, the peaceful atmosphere of the forest now replaced by a constant undercurrent of tension, every rustle of leaves and distant bird call drawing wary glances from the guards surrounding them. Ren rode close beside Ronan, her earlier vulnerability from their private conversation now hardened into fierce determination, understanding clearly that whatever fragile peace had existed before this journey had now shattered completely, replaced by a race against time that neither side could afford to lose. Thornfield turned out to be smaller than Ren remembered, a scattered collection of stone cottages and quiet farmland nestled against a slow-moving river, the kind of place easily overlooked by anyone not specifically searching for it. The advance party Ronan had sent earlier met them just outside the village boundary, their leader, a steady young officer named Callum, greeting them with visible relief. "We located a man matching the description you provided," Callum reported quickly, keeping his voice low despite the empty road surrounding them. "He goes by Fen, lives alone on the eastern edge of the village. We have not approached him directly, following your instructions, to wait for your arrival." "Has anyone else shown interest in this village recently?" Ronan asked, dismounting quickly and scanning the quiet surroundings with careful attention. "Not that we have noticed," Callum said, though villagers mentioned unfamiliar travelers passing through 2 days ago, asking general questions about local residents. Nothing specific enough to raise alarm at the time. Ronan exchanged a tense glance with Ren, both of them recognizing immediately that Draven's men had likely already begun searching this same area, perhaps even before their confrontation along the forest road. Time, already limited, had grown shorter still. "Take us to him," Ronan said, quietly, avoiding the main village path if possible. They followed Callum along a narrow trail, skirting the edge of the village, eventually arriving at a modest stone cottage, surrounded by a small, well-tended garden. Smoke rose gently from the chimney, and the quiet sound of someone moving inside suggested the cottage's occupant was indeed home. Ren's heart pounded as she approached the door, memories rushing back with unexpected intensity, the stranger's hand pulling her through broken glass, his voice urging her to run and never look back. She had spent years wondering whether she would ever see his face again, whether he had survived whatever consequences might have followed his choice to save her that night. Ronan knocked gently on the wooden door, stepping back slightly to allow Ren to stand more visibly, hoping recognition might ease whatever caution the man inside would naturally feel toward unexpected visitors. The door opened slowly, revealing an older man with weathered features and steady gray eyes, his posture carrying the subtle discipline of someone who had once lived a soldier's life, despite the simple farmer's clothing he now wore. His gaze moved cautiously across the group before settling on Ren, and for a long moment, he simply stared, something shifting slowly behind his careful expression. "It cannot be," he said quietly, his voice rough with disbelief. "Little Ren." "You remember me," Ren said, tears unexpectedly gathering at the corners of her eyes. "I have thought of you every single day since that night," Fen said, stepping back slowly to allow them inside his small cottage. "I always wondered whether you survived, whether you found somewhere safe to grow up. I never dared search for you directly, fearing it might draw dangerous attention toward you if I did." Once inside, seated around a simple wooden table, Ren introduced Ronan carefully, watching Fen's expression shift from confusion to guarded surprise upon learning the identity of the man sitting across from him. "The king himself, sitting in my humble cottage," Fen said, a faint, weary smile crossing his weathered face. "I never imagined such a visit in my lifetime." "I need to understand exactly what happened that night," Ronan said carefully. Ren has shared what she remembers, but her memories, understandably, remain fragmented from the perspective of a frightened child. "I need someone who witnessed those events with clearer understanding." Fen's expression grew somber, old pain resurfacing behind his steady eyes. "I served under your father for nearly 15 years, he said. "I believed, as many soldiers did, that our actions along that border served a greater purpose, securing peace and stability for the kingdom's future. That belief shattered the night we were ordered into the Eastern Valley." "What were your orders?" Ronan asked quietly. "Clear the valley entirely," Fen said. "Remove every family connected to the old trade agreements, ensuring the land could be fully absorbed into the Crown's expanding territory, without future legal complications." "We were told the families had already been relocated peacefully through official channels, and our task was simply to secure any remaining structures." "That was not true," Ren said quietly. "No," Fen agreed, his voice heavy with old guilt. "When we arrived, it became immediately clear that no relocation had occurred. Families were still living in their homes, completely unaware of what was coming. Some soldiers hesitated, questioning the orders. Lord Corwin Hale, overseeing the operation personally, made it clear that hesitation would not be tolerated." Ronan's jaw tightened, though he remained silent, allowing Fen to continue. "I was assigned to secure the Ashford household specifically," Fen said, looking toward Ren with quiet sorrow. "When I entered and saw a young child inside, alone in a back room, while the rest of the house had already been set ablaze, something inside me refused to follow through with those orders any further. I pulled you out through a side window and told you to run toward the forest, hoping you would find safety somewhere far from that valley. You saved my life," Ren said softly. "I failed to save your parents," Fen said, his voice breaking slightly. "I searched for them afterward, once the flames had spread too far to safely re-enter the house. I never found them. I have carried that failure with me every day since." "What happened after that night?" Ronan asked. "Why did you leave my father's service?" "I could not continue serving under orders that required such actions against innocent families," Fen said. "I deserted shortly afterward, knowing the risk of execution if caught, but unwilling to participate in further operations of that nature. I have lived quietly here in Thornfield ever since, keeping my past carefully hidden." Ronan sat in heavy silence for a long moment, processing the full weight of Fen's testimony, confirmation of everything Ren had shared, and worse, direct evidence of his own father's deliberate cruelty carried out under Corwin's careful oversight. "Would you be willing to testify to this before my council?" Ronan asked finally, formally, with full understanding of the danger such testimony would bring upon you. Fen considered the question carefully, his weathered face reflecting years of guilt and quiet suffering. "I have hidden from this truth long enough," he said finally. "If speaking now can bring some measure of justice to Ren's family, and prevent such cruelty from happening again under your rule, then yes, I will testify, regardless of the personal risk." Ren reached across the table, gently placing her hand over Fen's, gratitude and long-buried grief mingling together in her expression. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for that night, and for this." Before anyone could respond further, Callum burst through the cottage door, his expression tense with urgency. "Riders approaching from the western road," he said quickly, moving fast, armed, at least a dozen strong. Ronan rose immediately, his earlier calm replaced by sharp, decisive focus. "Draven's men," he said grimly. "They found us faster than expected." We cannot defend this cottage against a dozen armed riders with only 4 guards, Callum warned. Then we do not stay to defend it, Ronan said, already moving toward the door. We need to move Fen and Ren to safety immediately, before those riders arrive. Fen rose quickly, despite his age. Years of soldier's instinct clearly resurfacing beneath the calm farmer's exterior he had maintained for over a decade. There is a hidden path through the eastern woods, he said, used by traders avoiding tolls along the main road. It should allow us to slip away unseen, if we move quickly enough. Then lead the way, Ronan said, glancing briefly toward Ren, their eyes meeting with silent understanding of exactly how dangerous their next moments were about to become. We do not have time to waste. The eastern woods grew thick and shadowed almost immediately beyond Fen's small garden, roots and fallen branches making the narrow trail difficult to navigate quickly, though Fen moved with surprising confidence despite his years away from active soldiering. Ren followed close behind him, her breath coming quick and sharp, the distant sound of approaching horses growing louder behind them with every passing minute. Ronan and Callum brought up the rear alongside the remaining guards, weapons drawn, watching the trail behind them carefully for any sign of pursuit. Garrick, unaccustomed to such physical exertion, struggled to keep pace, though determination kept him moving steadily forward despite his labored breathing. "How much farther?" Ronan called quietly toward Fen, glancing back over his shoulder at the darkening woods behind them. "Not far," Fen replied, ducking beneath a low-hanging branch without slowing his pace. "The trail opens onto the river crossing just ahead. Once we cross, the path becomes easier to defend, narrow enough that pursuers cannot easily surround us." They emerged moments later, at the edge of a wide, slow-moving river, a narrow wooden bridge, stretching across toward the opposite bank. Fen led them quickly onto the bridge. Though halfway across, the sound of shouting erupted from the trail behind them, followed immediately by the sharp clatter of hooves against packed earth. They found the trail, Callum warned, glancing back toward the tree line, where several riders had just emerged, weapons already drawn. "Keep moving," Ronan ordered, positioning himself protectively near the rear of the group as they hurried across the remaining length of the bridge. Fen, Ren, Garrick continued toward the far bank immediately. The riders reached the bridge's entrance, just as the last of the group crossed onto solid ground on the opposite side. Their leader, the same broad-shouldered man who had confronted them along the forest road days earlier, reined his horse to a stop at the bridge's edge, studying the group across the river with cold calculation. "You should have heeded my earlier warning," he called across the water, his voice carrying easily in the quiet evening air. "Lord Draven grows tired of chasing shadows across the countryside. Tell your employer that hired thugs cannot silence truth forever," Ronan called back, his voice steady with authority, despite the tension gripping his chest. The rider's expression darkened, and he gestured sharply toward his men, several of whom dismounted, and began moving cautiously onto the narrow bridge itself, clearly intent on pursuing the group despite the water separating them. "We cannot outrun mounted riders on foot," Callum said urgently, glancing toward the dense woods stretching beyond the riverbank. Fen's eyes scanned the surrounding area quickly, old instincts sharpening beneath sudden pressure. "The bridge supports are old," he said suddenly. "I noticed decay along the central beams when we crossed earlier. If we can weaken them further, we may be able to collapse the bridge entirely, cutting off their pursuit." "There is no time to weaken support beams," Garrick said, panic evident in his voice, as the pursuing men drew closer across the bridge. "There might be," Ronan said, his eyes narrowing as he studied the wooden structure carefully. He turned quickly to one of his guards. "Your axe, now." The guard handed over his weapon immediately, and Ronan moved swiftly toward the near end of the bridge, striking hard and precise blows against the central support beam Fen had identified moments earlier. The old wood, already weakened by years of exposure to weather and water, began to crack audibly beneath the force of his strikes. The pursuing men, realizing the danger too late, shouted warnings to one another, quickly retreating back toward the far bank as the bridge's structure groaned ominously beneath them. With one final, powerful strike, Ronan shattered the weakened beam entirely, and the central section of the bridge collapsed downward into the river with a tremendous crash, sending several of the pursuing men tumbling into the water below, while others scrambled desperately back toward solid ground. Panic erupted among Draven's remaining men as their leader shouted furious commands. though the collapsed bridge now stood as an impassable barrier between the two groups, the swift current below making any immediate crossing dangerously impractical. "That will not hold them back forever," Ronan said, breathing heavily from the exertion, tossing the axe back to its owner. "But it should buy us enough time to reach safer ground." The group hurried away from the riverbank without further delay, moving quickly through the darkening woods as evening shadows deepened around them. Behind them, faint shouts of frustration echoed across the water, though no further pursuit followed immediately, the collapsed bridge proving an effective, if temporary, obstacle. They traveled well into the night, before finally stopping at a small hunting shelter Callum knew of, hidden deep within the forest, and rarely used outside of seasonal hunting expeditions. Exhausted, the group settled inside cautiously, posting careful watch throughout the remaining hours of darkness. Ren sat near the small fire Callum had carefully built, watching the flickering flames with quiet exhaustion, the events of the day settling heavily upon her. Ronan settled beside her after ensuring the perimeter watch was properly established, his own exhaustion evident despite the calm authority he maintained throughout their escape. "You saved all of us today," Ren said quietly, glancing toward him in the dim firelight. "We saved each other," Ronan replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "None of us would have survived this day alone." Fen, seated nearby, watched the quiet exchange between them with careful, knowing eyes, though he said nothing, allowing the moment to remain between the two of them undisturbed. "Once we return to the palace," Ren said after a long moment, "Draven and Corwin will know for certain that we have found Fen, and that he intends to testify against them." "Yes," Ronan agreed grimly, "which means we no longer have the luxury of careful, quiet investigation. We must move forward decisively, and quickly, before they find another way to silence this truth permanently." "What happens now?" Ren asked. Ronan was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flickering flames as he considered the weight of the path now stretching before them. "Now," he said finally, "we return to the palace, and we prepare for a confrontation that can no longer be avoided." The palace felt different upon their return, the familiar stone corridors somehow heavier beneath the weight of what waited ahead. Ronan wasted no time upon arriving, summoning his full council to gather within the grand hall the following morning, a formal session unlike any held since his coronation. Word spread quickly through the palace that something significant was about to unfold. Nobles arrived early, whispering among themselves, sensing the unusual tension radiating from the guards stationed more heavily than usual throughout the corridors. Mira found Ren briefly before the session began, her expression full of worry and unspoken questions. "Whatever happens today," Mira whispered, squeezing Ren's hand gently, "know that I believe in whatever truth you are fighting for." Ren offered a grateful, if nervous smile, before Callum guided her toward a private antechamber adjoining the grand hall, where Fen and Garrick already waited, along with two of Ronan's most trusted guards, standing watch at the door. Inside the grand hall itself, Ronan took his place upon the throne, his expression carrying none of the warmth Ren had witnessed during their private conversations, replaced instead by the composed, authoritative bearing befitting a king about to confront a crisis threatening the very foundation of his rule. Lord Corwin Hale and Lord Draven Blackwood stood among the assembled council members, their expressions carefully neutral, though tension remained visible beneath their practiced composure. "I have called this session," Ronan began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, "to address a matter of grave importance concerning actions taken during the border conflicts of 11 years ago, specifically regarding the Eastern Valley territories." Murmurs rippled through the assembled nobles, confusion and curiosity evident on many faces unfamiliar with the details Ronan was about to reveal. Corwin's expression remained carefully controlled, though his hands, clasped behind his back, tightened almost imperceptibly. "Evidence has come to my attention," Ronan continued, "suggesting that innocent families residing within that valley were deliberately targeted and destroyed under orders issued during my father's reign, disguised as routine border security operations." "Your Majesty," Corwin interjected smoothly, stepping forward with practiced calm. "Border conflicts of that era were chaotic and difficult to fully document. Surely, such serious accusations require more than fragmented, unverified claims before disrupting the stability of this council." "I agree entirely," Ronan replied evenly. which is why I have gathered direct testimony from a witness who personally participated in those events, alongside physical evidence connecting the operation directly to the Crown's own treasury records. Corwin's composure flickered slightly, though he maintained his outward calm. "And who exactly is this witness?" he asked. Ronan gestured toward the antechamber door, and Callum opened it, guiding Fen forward into the grand hall. Murmurs spread quickly among the assembled nobles as the weathered former soldier walked steadily toward the center of the hall, his posture straightening with quiet resolve, despite the many curious and suspicious eyes following his movement. Corwin's face paled visibly the moment he recognized Fen, old fear surfacing beneath his careful mask for just a fraction of a second before he forced his expression back into practiced neutrality. "This man served under my father's command during the Eastern Valley operation," Ronan announced. "He will now share what he personally witnessed that night." Fen stood tall despite the weight of every gaze fixed upon him, his voice steady, as he began recounting the events of that terrible night, the deliberate orders issued to destroy innocent families under Corwin's direct oversight, the child he had pulled from a burning house against explicit instructions, and the guilt he had carried through years of quiet exile from the life he once knew. The hall fell into stunned silence as Fen's testimony unfolded, nobles exchanging horrified glances, several visibly shaken by the deliberate cruelty described in such careful, painful detail. Corwin's composure crumbled steadily throughout the testimony, his earlier confidence replaced by mounting desperation as he realized the depth of evidence now standing openly against him. "This is preposterous," Corwin finally interjected, his voice sharper than before, edged with panic. "A deserter's fabricated story, offered undoubtedly in exchange for pardon or reward. This proves nothing." "It does not stand alone," Ronan said calmly, nodding toward Garrick, who stepped forward, carrying a small collection of documents. Treasury records recovered from the Crown's private vault confirm payment issued to mercenary forces for what was internally labeled a valley clearing operation, dated precisely to match the night in question. Garrick presented the documents formally before the council, allowing several senior nobles to examine them directly, murmurs of shock and disbelief rippling further through the assembled crowd as the physical evidence corroborated Fen's testimony exactly. Ren stepped forward then, entering the grand hall for the first time that morning, her presence drawing immediate attention from every corner of the room. She walked steadily toward the center, standing beside Fen with quiet, dignified strength, despite years of fear finally reaching this decisive moment. "I am the last surviving heir of the Ashford family," she announced clearly, her voice carrying farther than she expected across the silent hall. "My family was destroyed that night, simply because our land held value for the Crown's expansion. I have carried this truth alone for 11 years, hiding my identity simply to survive within these very walls." Corwin's eyes locked onto her, with something between fear and desperate calculation, clearly searching for any remaining argument capable of discrediting the mounting evidence against him. Draven, standing nearby, remained notably silent, his earlier confidence replaced by careful distance, clearly recalculating his own position, now that the alliance he had proposed appeared increasingly unlikely to succeed. "Lord Corwin Hale," Ronan said, his voice carrying the full weight of royal authority, "you personally oversaw the deliberate destruction of an innocent family, along with countless others, residing within that valley, under false pretense of official Crown business. This council will now determine appropriate consequences for such actions, taken directly against the values this Crown claims to uphold." Corwin's expression shifted rapidly between anger, desperation, and finally, resigned defeat as he recognized the impossibility of his position. "Your father ordered this operation," he said finally, bitterness edging his voice. "I simply carried out the commands given to me, as any loyal soldier would." "Loyalty does not excuse deliberate cruelty against innocent families," Ronan replied firmly. "Nor does it absolve you of personal responsibility for the choices you made that night. Choices that clearly went beyond simple obedience, given the personal oversight you maintained throughout the operation." The hall remained tensely silent as Ronan turned toward his assembled council, addressing them directly. "This Crown will no longer hide behind old cruelties committed in the name of expansion and security. Lord Corwin Hale will face formal judgment before this council, and any others found complicit in this deliberate destruction will face similar consequences, regardless of their current standing within this court. Draven shifted uncomfortably amid the assembled nobles, clearly recognizing the precarious nature of his own position, having aligned himself closely with Corwin in recent days. Ronan's gaze shifted deliberately toward him, a silent acknowledgement that his own involvement had not gone unnoticed. Lord Draven Blackwood, Ronan continued, will also answer for his role in attempting to obstruct this investigation, including hiring men to threaten and pursue witnesses seeking rightful justice. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Draven's carefully maintained composure finally shattered, his expression paling as he realized the extent to which his own actions had already been discovered and documented. As guards moved forward to formally detain both men, Ren stood quietly beside Fen, watching years of buried fear and grief finally give way to something she had almost forgotten was possible. A fragile, hard-won sense of justice finally within reach, after so many years of silence and hidden suffering. The weeks following the council session brought significant change throughout the kingdom. News of the formal judgment against Lord Corwin Hale and Lord Draven Blackwood spreading quickly beyond the palace walls into every corner of the realm. Some nobles expressed quiet unease at seeing such powerful men held accountable for actions committed under the previous king's rule, while many others, particularly among the common people, greeted the news with cautious hope that this new king intended to rule with genuine fairness, rather than simply preserving old traditions of unquestioned authority. Ren remained within the palace during this period, no longer hiding her true identity behind careful disguises and quiet servitude. Word of her family's history and her courage in bringing the truth forward spread throughout the court, earning her a respect she had never imagined possible during her years of fearful anonymity. Fen chose to remain within the palace as well, at Ronan's personal invitation, taking on a quiet advisory role helping to review and reform certain military practices that had gone unquestioned for far too long under the previous king's rule. The guilt he had carried for over a decade seemed to ease slightly with each passing week, replaced gradually by a renewed sense of purpose he had not felt since the night everything changed within that burning valley. Ronan worked tirelessly during those weeks, meeting with surviving families connected to the Eastern Valley destruction, offering formal acknowledgement and restitution wherever possible, though he understood clearly that no amount of compensation could truly undo the pain and loss caused by his father's cruel decisions. Still, he pressed forward, determined to build a reign defined by honesty, rather than the comfortable silence his father had relied upon for so long. One quiet evening, several weeks after the council session, Ronan found Ren, standing alone, in the same private study where their difficult conversation had first begun, staring thoughtfully out toward the darkened gardens below. "You seem lost in thought," he said gently, stepping quietly into the room. Ren turned toward him, a small, genuine smile crossing her features, so different from the guarded caution she had carried during their first private conversation weeks earlier. "I was simply remembering how frightened I felt standing in this room that first night," she said. "I never imagined everything that would follow from a single whispered sentence." "Neither did I," Ronan admitted, moving to stand beside her near the window. "Though I find myself grateful, despite everything difficult that followed, that you found the courage to speak that truth aloud." "It was not easy," Ren said quietly, "watching you turn pale, wondering whether you would protect me or dismiss everything I said to preserve your own comfort." "I understand that fear," Ronan said, "and I am sorry it took so long for you to feel safe enough within these walls to finally share the truth you carried alone for so many years." Ren studied him carefully in the soft evening light, noting again the quiet sincerity that had drawn her toward him, despite every instinct urging caution during those first uncertain days. "What happens now?" she asked. "For the kingdom, and for us?" Ronan considered the question thoughtfully before answering. "The kingdom will need continued healing," he said. "Old wounds do not close quickly, nor should they be forgotten, simply for the sake of convenient peace. I intend to continue building a reign rooted in honesty, even when that honesty proves difficult." "And for us?" Ren asked again, her voice softer now. Ronan turned to face her fully, his expression carrying a vulnerability she had rarely witnessed from him during their earlier, more urgent encounters. "I find that I do not wish to imagine my future without you standing beside me," he said quietly, not simply as the witness who exposed a painful truth, but as someone whose courage and strength I have come to deeply admire and care for." Ren's heart quickened at his words. Years of guarded caution, slowly giving way to something warmer, something she had not allowed herself to fully imagine during years spent surviving alone. "I never expected to find anything resembling happiness within these palace walls," she admitted. "Yet somehow, despite everything difficult we have faced together, I find myself feeling exactly that." Ronan reached gently for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, in a simple, quiet gesture that carried more meaning than any grand declaration could have offered. "Then perhaps," he said softly, "we can build something new together, out of everything painful we have uncovered. Not simply healing old wounds, but creating something genuinely good for this kingdom, and for ourselves." Outside the study window, the palace gardens lay peaceful beneath a clear night sky, no longer hiding secrets, no longer casting shadows over hidden dangers waiting to strike. The kingdom that stretched beyond those garden walls remained far from perfect, countless challenges still waiting to be addressed in the months and years ahead. Yet for the first time in longer than either of them could clearly remember, both Ronan and Ren felt something resembling genuine hope settling quietly between them. In the months that followed, the kingdom slowly began to heal, its people gradually coming to trust a king, willing to acknowledge and correct the mistakes of those who ruled before him. Fen continued serving as a trusted advisor, his guilt finally easing into quiet purpose. Mira remained close beside Ren, proud beyond words of the courage her friend had shown throughout everything that unfolded. And within the palace walls that had once held nothing but fear and hidden secrets for a frightened young Omega girl, Ren finally found something she had believed lost forever, the night her family's home burned to the ground. She found belonging, she found purpose, and standing beside a king who had chosen truth over comfortable silence, she found at last a place she could genuinely call home.